Your organization just passed its SOC 2 audit. Leadership is celebrating. The sales team is using it to close deals. And you're sitting there knowing you still have real security problems the audit never looked at. If that tension sounds familiar, we need to talk about what compliance actually tells us and what it doesn't. And to start off, let's talk about the uncomfortable truth here. This puts security managers in a very awkward spot. You understand why compliance matters. External validation helps with customers. Frameworks give you structure. Having that certificate means something. But you also know that passing an audit and actually being secure aren't the same thing. And here's what makes this tricky. Compliance audits aren't worthless. They do provide real value. They provide, well, the problem is that they measure something different than whether your security actually works day to day. Think about what an auditor does. They show up for a defined period. They review specific controls against framework requirements. They look at documentation. They sample some transactions. They interview people. Then they write a report about whether you met those requirements during that time window. That's different from evaluating whether your organization effectively reduces risk when nobody's watching. As far as what audits can and can't see, let me go ahead and give you more of a concrete example. An auditor reviews your access termination process. They pulled 25 terminated employee accounts from a list of 200. They verify access was removed within policy. Those 25 cases look good, control passes. But they didn't look at the other 175 cases. They didn't see what happens, on a random Tuesday, when your IT team is short-staffed. They didn't measure, whether the process actually works consistently, or just work for that sample they checked. The audit proved your control can work. It didn't prove it works reliably. And that's not a flaw in the audit. Auditors can't watch your operations for 6 months. They can't check every transaction. They work within scope, boundaries, and use sampling because that's the only practical way to do this. The problem starts when we treat the audit report as proof of comprehensive security instead of what it actually is. Confirmation that specific controls met specific requirements at a specific point in time. And here's where it gets interesting. A lot of compliance requirements can be satisfied with documentation. You pass a control by having the right policies and showing the right evidence, even when what's happening operationally is pretty different. Take quarterly access reviews. Most frameworks require them. So you document the process, you schedule the reviews, managers get spreadsheets, listings and about everything in there. They're complete. They go ahead and complete the reviews, right? You collect evidence, the control passes, but what's actually happening during those reviews? In a lot of organizations, managers aren't looking at systems they don't really understand. They're approving access because they trust their people and they're scared of breaking something. The review happened. It got documented, but nobody generally evaluated whether that access still made sense. The control exists on paper. It produces evidence. It satisfies the audit, but the security value is minimal because the process became a checkbox exercise, instead of a real evaluation. And auditors have a hard time seeing this gap. They can verify the review occurred and it was documented. They can't easily tell whether someone spent 3 minutes clicking approve all or actually thought about each item. Then there's a timing problem, and here's another issue, right? The audits are snapshots. Your security environment changes constantly. Let's say the audit covers January through March. The auditor shows up in April. The report gets issued in June. By then, you've hired 50 people, launched new systems, had some turnover. Everything the auditor looked at was accurate then, but it's June now and a lot has changed. Yet that report gets treated as current proof of security. Customers look at it at 8 months later and assume it reflects your security today. Leadership points to it as evidence that security is handled. Nobody accounts for all the changes since the audit period ended. Some of those changes are obvious. You launched a new product, you migrated infrastructure. Those are visible. Other changes are more gradual. Employees leave, and their access doesn't get cleaned up. New systems get deployed without going through the formal process. Teams find workarounds for controls that slow them down. Configuration drifts as systems diverge from baseline. The audit told you what existed then. It tells you nothing about what exists now. And as far as the risk acceptance as strategy, most frameworks let you formally accept risks instead of fixing them, and that makes sense. Not every risk needs immediate remediation. Sometimes the cost exceeds the benefit. Business judgment matters, but acceptance can become a way to pass audits without fixing problems. When audit prep uncovers an issue, you have options. Fix it, which takes time and resources, or formally accept it, which requires documentation and management sign off, but lets you pass with the audit without actually addressing the problem. In the path of least resistance often leads to acceptance. Document the risks, get management approval. The auditor sees it was formally accepted per your process. The audit continues. The problem remains. This gets worse over time. Accepted risks pile up. They sit in a register that gets reviewed once a year in a meeting where no one has time to reconsider dozens of old items. The list grows. Nobody goes back to verify the original reasoning still makes sense, or that the business context hasn't changed. You end up with extensive documentation of risks you choose not to fix. It satisfies compliance. It leaves security gaps unaddressed. As far as what gets missed, every audit has boundaries. Some systems are in scope, others aren't. Some processes get examined, others fail outside the focus. That's necessary. Audits can't cover everything, but it means passing an audit doesn't prove comprehensive security across the entire organization. Your SOC 2 audit may cover production systems, but exclude development environments, internal tools, or recently acquired systems. Those excluded areas might represent real risk. The audit doesn't touch them. The report doesn't address them. And sometimes organizations take advantage of this. They focus security work on what they know will be audited. In-scope systems get resources. Out-of-scope systems get neglected. You end up with islands of compliance surrounded by security gaps nobody examined. And so how do you use compliance properly? I'm saying it's a tool, not a destination. Treat, as far as frameworks go, treat them as foundations, not finish lines. Use them to establish baseline practices. Let them create structure and accountability. But then build your actual security program around your specific risks, your threats, in your environment. And monitor the gap between what's documented and what actually happens. Don't just look at policies and procedures. Ask the people doing the work how controls actually operate on a normal day. Observe what really happens, not what's supposed to happen. Review your accepted risks regularly. Don't let them become forgotten risks. Check whether the original reasoning still applies. Verify compensating controls are still working. Reassess whether you'd still make the same decision today. When you're planning work, be clear about whether you're addressing risk or satisfying an audit requirement. Both have value, but they're different activities. Don't let all your security work become compliance driven. And when you implement something for compliance, ask what else in an area deserves attention, even if the framework doesn't require it. Use compliance as a prompt to think about security more broadly. Let me be clear, about what compliance does provide. It establishes baseline practices based on industry experience. It gives you structure if you're building a program. It creates external accountability that helps you get leadership, attention, and resources. It provides standards customers and partners understand. When someone asks about your security, a SOC 2 report, or ISO cert communicates your approach in a format they can recognize. And the audit process itself often services issues you might have missed. Preparing documentation forces you to examine whether controls actually exist. Evidence collection reveals gaps. These benefits are real. Compliance work isn't wasted, but those benefits don't extend to proving your security works effectively day to day between audits. As far as wrapping this up, your compliance certificate proves you met specific requirements at a specific time. That matters. It has value, but your actual security depends on what you do every single day when the auditors aren't there. Use compliance to establish foundations and create accountability. Then build security practices that address your real risks and keep working when no one's collecting evidence. If you're a security manager dealing with this tension, take a look at the gap between your documented controls and what actually happens operationally. That gap is real, is where the real work lives. If you found this useful, I appreciate you'd subscribe, and follow and share. And if you're dealing with this challenge in your organization, I'm curious to know, how you're handling it. Drop a comment, let me know what you're seeing. Talk to you later.